Thank you all for joining today's webinar, Drawdown-Aligned Business, Investments and Finance. This is part 2, Decarbonizing Corporate Cash. My name is Julian Kraus-Polk. I'm a senior associate at Drawdown Labs, which is Project Drawdown's private sector testing ground for accelerating the scaling of climate solutions quickly, safely, and equitably. This webinar is being hosted by Project Drawdown in collaboration with Climate Safe Lending Network, the Outdoor Policy Outfit, BankFWD, and Bank on Our Future. I want to remind you all that this webinar is part 2 of a series on Drawdown-Aligned Business and Finance, Drawdown-Aligned Business, Investments and Finance. The first of which was on greening 401ks, which was held last week. And we're going to be circulating the recordings and the follow-up resources from these webinars in the coming weeks. So these webinars are intended to be both informative, but also action-oriented. Our goal is that companies leave these sessions with inspiration and also clear action items. I want to start things off with a quote from Paul Pullman, former CEO of Unilever. He writes, "If your company is really serious about your climate targets and about decarbonizing your value chain, decarbonizing corporate cash and investments is one of the most effective tools you have." So just to reiterate, this is a new frontier for business climate action with massive potential to shift the economics of climate solutions, especially as the federal climate spending package seems to be stalled out. These private sector finance-related actions become all the more important and urgent. So we're thrilled to be doing this session today. So the agenda for today, we have a packed agenda. First, we're going to start off by setting some kind of context. So Jamie is going to come in and contextualize this webinar in the broader context of the Drawdown-Aligned Business Framework. Then we're going to hear an overview of the Carbon Bankroll report and an overview of financed emissions in general. And then we have a great panel discussion with some awesome speakers today. And then after the panel discussion, we're going to open things up to a Q&A from the audience. And then I'm going to, at the very end, kind of just go over some next steps for taking action. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jamie Alexander, the director of Drawdown Labs.
Great, thanks, Julian. And thank you all for being here with us today. Thanks to our partners for co-hosting this session with us and for providing the critical information that you'll hear in this webinar. So I wanted to quickly ground today's session in the broader landscape of corporate sustainability work. As we all know, corporate sustainability leadership is a moving target and seems to be an ever-evolving space. Every day, it seems like we're learning about new ways that businesses can influence the climate crisis for better or worse. And what leadership looked like in the past is no longer sufficient to the scale and urgency of the crisis we face today, especially, as Julian said, in the face of yet another failed federal climate bill. We know that leading business can and must go well beyond simple net zero emissions reductions goals into leveraging their full social, political, financial, and employee power in pursuit of a stable climate and just future for all people. So with that in mind, we at Project Drawdown and Drawdown Labs created what you see here, which we call the Drawdown-Aligned Business Framework. This was our effort at really getting out on the table a broader suite of leverage points that companies have at their disposal to either help or hinder climate action. So in this framework, you see that we've identified 8 leverage points, which, if implemented across the business community, could really help create a tidal wave of systemic climate action closer to the speed and scale required that we need to match the climate crisis we face. So we know that this framework represents a high bar for most companies, which is why over the coming year, we'll be doing deep dives on these leverage points like this one today to provide businesses with clear guidance and hands-on support to implement and help normalize these critical leverage points. So today we're going to be double clicking here in this climate finance box and a deeper dive on how business can help accelerate climate finance by decarbonizing their corporate cash and investments. So thanks again for being here with us, and back to you, Julian.
Awesome, thanks so much, Jamie. So we're going to get right into it. I'm just going to quickly introduce the great list of speakers that we have today, and thanks to all the speakers for joining us today. So Paul Moinester is the executive director and co-founder of the Outdoor Policy Outfit. He's also one of the co-authors of the Carbon Bankroll report, and he's going to be providing opening remarks and then helping to moderate the panel session. James Vaccaro is the executive director of the Climate Safe Lending Network, also a co-author of the Carbon Bankroll report. Vanessa Fejens-Turner is the executive director of BankFWD, also a co-author of the Carbon Bankroll report. Charlie Bischoff is the treasury manager for Patagonia, who's been working for some time to lower the carbon intensity of its cash holdings and broader financial supply chain, including insurance partners. And then Patrick Flynn is the senior vice president and global head of sustainability for Salesforce, who's taken some promising first steps towards tracking and addressing the company's financed emissions. And before I hand things over to Paul, I want to quickly read a tweet actually from Bill McKibben, just to kind of set the scene, describing the Carbon Bankroll report's findings. So McKibben writes, "I think this is the most important set of climate numbers I've come across in a decade. They are the Rosetta Stone for understanding why banks and the financial system are at the center of the crisis." So this is just kind of emphasizing again how important this data and then also these levers that companies have really are. And with that, I'll hand things over to Paul Moinester.
Yeah, thanks, Julian. Appreciate it, and appreciate you all being here today. As Julian and others teed up, like this is really sort of the cutting edge of corporate sustainability, and so what we're talking about today is pretty new and novel. And so excited for you all to be here and to hopefully move together collaboratively. And so Julian, if you want to go ahead and sort of tee up the presentation, that'd be great. Yeah, so back in May, we released a report called the Carbon Bankroll, the Climate Impact and Untapped Power of Corporate Cash. And Julian, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide there. So this project was a joint venture between the Climate Safe Lending Network and James, who is the co-author of the report, the Outdoor Policy Outfit, my organization, and BankFWD, represented by Vanessa Fejens-Turner today. And so the three of us came together last year to start working on this project. And while the report was very much the beginning of the journey and the research that we conducted, you'll see today that really what we discovered was something new that we truly believe will be a big future component of corporate sustainability moving forward. So Julian, next slide. Thanks. And so as far as how we got here, around spring of last year, James, Vanessa, and I just started having the conversation of all these companies started coming out with big climate commitments around what they were going to do around net zero. And we were at this really exciting explosion of growth in the sustainability space. And more companies were coming out with these 120-page sustainability reports. But within those reports, we never saw anything about banking being mentioned, and it wasn't tied to any net zero commitments. But what we intuitively knew, and from our experience working in the space for a while, is that where you bank and how you bank has a big climate impact, and that ultimately companies are in control of that. And so we started kind of asking this very general question of, what are the emissions generated by corporate cash and investments? How do we measure that? And why isn't it tied to corporate sustainability goals? Where does it fit into, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions? And how do we ensure that banking and investments and other parts of the sort of what are called the financial supply chain become a part of corporate sustainability moving forward? And so next slide, Julian. Thanks. And so this idea of a financial supply chain, essentially corporate financial activities, cash management, investing, pensions. Historically, these things have been seen as climate neutral activities. They are just done as part of the business, but they're very core to how businesses operate, but they're not considered part, or they hadn't been factored in and considered part of, a company's scope 3 emissions or part of their corporate sustainability challenges. And when we've talked to companies leading up to the report, we very much learned that this is a new way of thinking, and that, just as companies are working to address other parts of their supply chains, from their parts to manufacturing, energy, I mean, the entire gambit of it, banking is very much a part of that, but it hadn't been considered part of it before. And so, the general premise behind this is that just as companies do with all aspects of their supply chain, they need to be working proactively to decarbonize what we've dubbed the financial supply chain. And so, next slide. So when we started running the numbers, to be honest, like we were very shocked and floored. And there's going to be a lot of data here today, and we can go back through all this because I only have a few minutes here to present. But essentially, we started asking the question of like, what percentage of emissions is this for companies? Is it 3%? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? And when we started running back of the envelope calculations, we noticed that it was much, much, much larger than that. And we brought in an incredible data firm, South Pole, that's an international leader on these types of analysis, and started running the numbers. And essentially what we found was that for many of the largest companies in the world, including PayPal and Meta, Alphabet, Google, that not only are their corporate cash and investment emissions a very large source of emissions, it's actually larger than all of their other emissions combined. Just to note here, because it didn't make it into the slide, for Disney, that 169 number is just scope 1 and 2 emissions. For all the other companies here, we're talking scope 1, 2, and 3. And so even for companies like Microsoft and Salesforce, it was their largest source of emissions. For Apple, it was their second largest source of emissions. And so we can go back through these numbers, but just as sort of a quick top line, this is what we found. And even for companies like Amazon that have a very large carbon footprint, that it still constitutes one of their largest sources of emissions. And so next slide, Julian. Thanks so much. So just to sort of ground this in some very real life examples. So for PayPal, which was very much an outlier, and we should note going into this that there's a bit of a disconnect here when we talk about the percentages. The overall absolute emissions is what's ultimately most important. And to say that, like, for a lot of companies that reduce their emissions, I mean, part of the reason these numbers are so high for PayPal and Google and Alphabet and others is because they've done so much to bring down their other emissions. And so as a comparison, their unaddressed finance emissions are much higher. But for PayPal, what we're talking about is 55 times larger than the company's scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions as they reported in 2021. For Google, we're talking about 38 times larger than the company's scope 1 emissions over the last 5 years combined. And for Netflix, this is, in 2021, it generated 10 times more emissions than the entire worldwide streaming of Netflix. And so this is a really massive source of unaddressed emissions. And so next slide, James. So the question is, how is this possible? And essentially what it ultimately comes down to is that companies are generating more cash and have more investments than they've ever historically had. And that money just doesn't sit passively in bank accounts. It goes, it's invested in things. The banks then turn around and lend and underwrite. And because of how carbon intensive the financial sector is, it ends up generating a substantial source of emissions. And so when Apple has $1 billion and they put it in a bank account, that money is then going out into the world and funding a lot of things that Apple themselves wouldn't necessarily fund or wouldn't necessarily want their money to be funding. And so anyway, next slide, Julian. And so when you take a step back and you sort of start to understand why this is the case, it's helpful to just take a quick note at the banking sector, which for a very long time, like I said, has sort of been viewed as more of a climate neutral sector, but it's actually one of the largest emitters in the world. And so, since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, the world's 60 largest banks have invested more than $4.6 trillion in the fossil fuel industry. During that same time period, the biggest banks in the United States invested more than $1.2 trillion. And so for those US banks, the emissions factor from those investments is massive. And so if the US banking sector were a country, it would actually be the 5th largest emitter in the world, just below Russia. So next slide. So when it comes to our methodology, I'm happy to get into more of this during the course of the presentation, but so essentially what we did, and we only had publicly available data. And so our note on the methodology is we did the best that we could based on it. There's much more refinement and granularity that we can have moving forward. But essentially what we did is we assessed companies' latest environmental reports to sort of get that baseline number for their emissions. We then compared that to the company's 2021 financial reporting to understand where their cash and cash equivalents were. And then we worked with South Pole to develop calculations based on and using carbon intensity numbers for all of these different sectors. So, things like commercial credit, equity, fixed income, mortgages, et cetera. And so we weren't able to go specifically into any of these companies' specific investments and banking practices because none of that stuff is publicly reported. And so moving forward, very much the next step and what we're working on with a number of our partners is to sort of figure out what this looks like in terms of when you start opening up the books and you know who your banking partners are and where your money is being invested, how do you create more granular, precise calculations? So next slide, if you don't mind, Julian. Thanks. And so just to sort of close here, like I said, we're at the very, very beginning of this new sustainability tool and new sort of part of the corporate sustainability framework. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to establish the best practices around this and to establish solutions around it. We're very much stymied by the fact that there aren't a lot of great banking partners right now, but there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for companies to move forward on this now with the simple steps of starting to measure and publish your emissions. And it's should be noted that we believe this is going to become a standard sustainability practice moving forward. And we're in conversations with a number of reporting frameworks, including the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, to sort of establish this as a best practice when it comes to reporting emissions. And so from there, once you sort of know what your emissions are, you can work to engage your financial institutions to start having these conversations. Many of the companies that we've talked to, they haven't gone to their banks and said, hey, you're a large source of our emissions. Let's figure out how we can reduce them, just like they do with all other aspects of their supply chain. And then, so by demonstrating demand for these types of green products, by starting to break up your banking and move money to different banks, out of high emissions banks and to low emission banks, and by potentially even switching your bank if and when possible, you can start really demonstrating a strong demand, which sends a very clear market signal. And so last but not least, is this catalyzing systemic change. It's part of what we'll talk about today during the panel conversation, but what makes this solution so exciting is that it's not just a new source of emissions that companies need to work to try to mitigate. What we really are on is the precipice of a whole new framework for how companies that are really committed to systemic change are able to leverage the power of their banking and their investing to transform the financial sector and to start moving billions, if not trillions of dollars away from fossil fuel investments and other types of high carbon intensive sectors and deforestation, and move that money towards funding the green energy and climate friendly solutions that we need moving forward. So I'll wrap there for now as far as things go, and we can start moving into the more fun presentation with our great panelists.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that presentation, Paul. And I'll just hand the mic right back to you to help moderate this great panel we have today.
Great. Thanks, Julian, and thanks for the help with the slides. So first question to the report co-author, James. Would love just to kind of have you, there are a lot of blank spots in the presentation there, turning our 50-page report into an 8-minute presentation. But, curious to get your thoughts on why finance emissions have been overlooked for the past and why they haven't been a core element of the corporate sustainability toolbox. But more importantly, why is it so important that these companies start addressing these emissions in terms of the climate impact that they can have moving forward?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Welcome, everyone. I think that there's a sort of a narrow answer and a broad answer. So the narrow answer is that the data which is now available was not available before. So banks in the last few years have been developing methodologies on a pragmatic basis to be able to turn what is it they're funding on their balance sheets into a meaningful sort of sense of, well, what's the carbon emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions associated with that lending. And this has been organized in different ways. There's been an organization called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting and Financials, which has started in the Netherlands through an organization I used to work for, and started sort of spreading through the world, and has now become kind of the common platform for carbon accounting. It helps to baseline, to kind of level set across the financial system to be able to kind of make some of these practical judgments and get some meaningful data. that's the kind of the narrow view, that there wasn't this data before and now there is this data, so you can start connecting the databases and saying, oh, this is the kind of the volume, the quantities in different sectors, in particular the high emitting sectors. I think the real reason it's been overlooked is that there has been a fundamental shift in terms of how people see and view finance, from finance being thought of as a neutral follower of the economy to finance as being a driving catalyst. I think through some of the positive parts of sustainable finance and the sustainable finance agenda, which have definitely kind of achieved a lot of impact, there's a double edge to that, which is, oh yeah, finance really can have an impact, positive as well as negative. And whereas it's trying to take the credit for the good stuff, it also has to take responsibility for the negative. And by being a driving catalyst in this sort of finance, economy, sustainability nexus, finance can be thought of as it's a powerful force in terms of how we're going to be able to drive the economy in the right direction, and specifically banking. So banking is making long-term credit decisions into the economy based upon people's more short-term, or companies' more short-term money. So it's actually transforming what is in the day-to-day into the kind of the infrastructure and the activities which are going to be around for decades to come. And that pivot point right there, that is what makes this particularly interesting as a leverage point for companies to influence the direction of those flows of finance into the real economy for that systemic change in the transition.
Great. Thanks so much, James. Appreciate that answer. And excited to turn it over to Patrick from Salesforce. And Salesforce has been an incredible partner from us from the beginning of this project. So thanks, Patrick, again, for all of you and your team's support. And would love to just kind of get an understanding from you about why is Salesforce prioritizing this issue, and why are you so personally excited about it? Every time we talk about it, you're sort of full of this energizing spirit around the sort of the can-do spirit, both within Salesforce and then from a community corporate standpoint.
Oh, sure. You just pull the microphone when I start going too long. You're right. I'm really excited to be here. Yeah. Thrilled to see so many old friends and make some new ones. The part about why is Salesforce motivated, maybe 3, 4, 10 different answers. I mean, one, truly we're a company that from the very start was built on our values and believes that business is the greatest platform for change, and that business needs to solve humanity's most pressing issues. Also, in the state of this current climate emergency, we need all hands on deck, everyone doing everything they can. Really, it's a moment for quote unquote and strategies, which is sort of every good strategy done with expert precision as fast as possible, and fast as possible being as fast as the highest quality will allow. More specifically, one of Salesforce's goals is that our full scope 1, 2, 3 location-based emissions will follow a 1.5 degree trajectory. So that is, for those geeky enough to catch a couple of different nuances there, like far more difficult than a science-based target, which we do have. There's no way it will trend in the right direction until the goods and services we buy are being built and delivered with clean grids, with clean transportation. It tethers us essentially to the forward progress of the globe. And so we've made a bit of a corporate goal out of the fact that we are all in this together, which of course is very much true. So then you start searching for some of the biggest levers for change, and a couple of them show up here that are really important to me. One is finance. And I loved, James, your point of sort of the juxtaposition of short-term cash positions being used to define our long-term future. That's a big piece of the disconnect here that we're trying to solve. The other, Paul, you hit it, which is when you say the financial supply chain, I hear the words customer voice there. Salesforce is the leader in the customer relationship. So for now 7+ years leading the company's sustainability strategy, I've learned to see the world through customer tinted glasses a little bit. And it started also from the fact that we don't own really any of our buildings, we don't own really any of our data centers. So we've always been pushing our sustainability program through clear communication with our suppliers about what we want to see and what might be different in the future. And this, to me, just like you say, the financial supply chain, this is a moment where the customer voice can be refined with greater clarity from all of this data. And we now have the ability to more specifically say, climate is important to us, it affects us this way, and I'd like either you, a bank, to help me understand why you are doing more leadership than is reflected in these numbers, and or to bring forward products and the opportunity for us to do even better in our collaboration with you. So just like you say, I think it's the very beginning. Just like Bill says, I think this data is some of the most important we've seen in a really long time, and just the beginning of sharpening the dialogue between company or even individual and bank in order to drive greater change.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Patrick. And that's actually a really natural tie-in to sort of the next question I was going to ask you, Charlie, because I think as far as companies go, as far as really flexing your customer voice and sort of engaging with banks, you know, as far as I'm aware, Patagonia has been on that journey for longer than any other company. I mean, I think somewhere around 4 years or so. So we'd love to get an understanding from you about why Patagonia is prioritizing this issue and sort of what that journey has looked like as you've started over the last, or worked over the last 4 years to really flex that customer voice.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I think I work for a clothing company, but it more and more feels like I work for an activist that uses clothing sales to drive the activism work their company does. I think that's a reflection of how we were founded, the values of our founders, but also the worsening climate crisis. We actually changed our mission statement a couple of years ago to "We're in business to save our home planet," and I think that's a really strong reflection of how serious our business is transforming to. I think historically we've always been about doing less harm, or doing, making clothing with as least harm as possible. But now we're transitioning into what can we do to actually leave the planet a better place than how we found it. So I think that leads into a very strong ethos of value alignment. We're very careful with who we select as partners all across the board in terms of making sure that we're proud to work with those who we work with. And historically, we've been very good about that in our manufacturing supply chain. I think Patagonia for decades has been a pioneer of engaging with factories around the world and trying to make sure we're making clothing with as least harm as possible. And also basically, ushering our factories along and making them better. But as the climate crisis worsens, and as we've changed our mission statement, that's tasked all areas of Patagonia to find ways to contribute. So I look at it as just an extension of the manufacturing supply chain work we've always done as a company. We're now expanding the scope of our supply chain to include our financial supply chain. So that's kind of why we started looking at who we bank with. And I think more of a direct spark to this whole project we've undergone over the last 4 years was the Dakota Access Pipeline. Patagonia was actively supporting those that were protesting against it 4 or 5 years ago, at least. And when we looked at the banks who were funding that pipeline, we realized that some of our largest banking partners and our lenders and where our cash was were the ones that were funding that pipeline. And as a company that takes pride in being a climate leader, that was pretty unacceptable to us. So that's kind of led us on this multi-year journey of basically reevaluating every single bank we work with and making changes, not only on the grounds of the best business relationship, but also the best sustainability relationship. So balancing those two as opposed to just looking at the business side of things.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Charlie. And sort of continuing on that note of that customer engagement part, I mean, Vanessa, where BankFWD started was very much at the heart of customer engagement. And curious to kind of get your thoughts from your experience, both working in the sort of the individual world in which you started with BankFWD, and now as you move to these more institutional side of the world, what are some of the barriers companies have as far as taking action to decarbonizing their cash and their investments, and how do you believe they can go about best surmounting those challenges?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you everyone also for being here. I think where we have to start acknowledging is that this is a really big paradigm shift for every company and every individual out there. Just as Charlie and Patrick have said, they've approached their sustainability strategies increasingly from the vantage point of how to do the most good versus how to do no harm. And I think key to that is the notion that cash is not a neutral entity any longer in the ways that we have traditionally viewed it to be, and that banks and financial partners are not peripheral and secondary to our key relationships as individuals and as companies, but actually first and foremost, some of our biggest drivers that actually do reflect, determine, and even impede our corporate and personal missions. And this goes for other sectors as well, like foundations, universities, and more. So some of that is getting that mindset. From there, then we also realize that as first adopters and breaking new ground, as we engage with our financial partners, this is a relatively new concept for them to hear from their clients. Clients have not traditionally been engaging with financial partners as fully around their climate responsibility. This starts holding banks accountable, which is where BankFWD has been working with individual networks and now with corporate networks to ensure that banks are hearing from their clients that this is a critical component of determining their client's business. And that means engaging with your bank, letting them know first and foremost what it is you're looking for from them. BankFWD has tools for doing this. We will walk folks through this. We have letter templates we will adapt for any use. And that is a crucial step. But it's also important to remember as we think towards creating a race to the top among financial partners to compete among themselves to have the best climate records, that there are difficulties in limitations to what all banks offer. And there are many of you on this call will recognize that the banks that offer the best services for large companies and large corporations are almost are entirely the banks that have the most exposure to the most harmful climate drivers like fossil fuels. So the largest banks that are the easiest to do business with are in fact the banks you don't want to do business with. That's the largest challenge. And so the next step in this movement and this effort is for companies, individuals, and motivated clients to engage with their banks, to insist that they be better because your worlds and your sustainability records are now entirely interchanged and interdependent on each other, but also to begin interacting with second-tier banks. In particular, we are working with banks like First Republic that have much less exposure to fossil fuels, to let them know that they have a huge opportunity ahead of them if they can improve their services and improve their climate practices, that they could capture some degree of business from these corporate networks.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Vanessa. And that point that you raised about this idea, and it was something I neglected to mention, but I mean, part of what we've sort of figured out with all of this, right, is that every dollar in, whether it's, you know, cash in a bank account or an investment, has an associated carbon footprint with it. And that really is key about trying along the lines of trying to track and measure and reduce that. And so, you know, on that note, as you talked about, you know, moving over to you, Charlie, and we're going to move into a bit more of a lightning round now because we only have a few minutes left because we want to make sure that we're going to leave some time for panel, for questions from the audience. But, you know, as far as sort of Patagonia's strategy goes for addressing finance emissions, you know, y'all are in a unique position as a private company, but, you know, really curious to get your take on kind of what you've done as far as your strategy for addressing those emissions, and what you might recommend to other companies as they go about looking at how they decarbonize their cash and look at their banking and investment as far as a vehicle for climate progress.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, we were pretty unsatisfied with who we were banking with when we realized the level of fossil fuel involvement most of our banking partners were in. So we decided to basically realign our entire global banking structure, which meant reevaluating about 30 different global banks around the world, ranging from $3 trillion banks down to less than $1 billion local banks in the Alps and South America and all the areas where Patagonia does business. And so as a large global company, Vanessa kind of alluded to this earlier, we rely on large global banks for the most part. As much as we'd love to work with all B Corp banks or 100% fossil fuel free banks, which are generally very small banks, it's just not possible for us. We still need to rely on these large banks because they provide the technology we need, they have the size that we need, and they have the international reach that we need. So our strategy was to kind of spread out our banks. For 95% of our banking needs, they're going to continue to be met by large global banks, but we set a baseline requirement for eligibility to bank with. So our requirements are that of the large banks that we work with, they need to have prohibitive policies that prevent lending to the tar sands, coal, and Arctic drilling. So that was number one. And then number two is we need banks that are dedicated to transparency and also a strong trajectory. Some of the banks that we've decided to continue partnering with long term, they're not the best today, but we feel that they're the most committed and they have the most aggressive trajectory toward becoming fossil fuel free. And a lot of that is evidenced based off of their engagement with measuring financed emissions. And then meanwhile, there's going to be opportunities for Patagonia to peel away some services from these large banks to the First Republics of the world or the amalgamated banks of the world. These are generally very small banks, but there's no reason why some of the services that we require can't be met by those banks. And then a couple other examples of things that we've done is we've expanded our cash management strategy on the Treasury side. We have a CD portfolio, a certificate of deposit portfolio that is invested in community banks across the US, primarily underserved communities. So there's a bit of a social component to that as well. And then we also have a portfolio of fixed income securities, kind of like a liquid investment portfolio that invests exclusively in green bonds and other sustainability oriented securities. And then we've taken the same banking mentality to insurance as well. So just like we're reevaluating all of the banks we work with, we're reevaluating all of the insurance companies we work with to make sure that they're not insuring and investing in the industries that we're trying to move away from.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much, Charlie. And, Patrick, sort of similar question over to you. And I know you're a little bit newer on the journey as far as where things go, but, as you look at Salesforce, and I think one thing that's really key to note about the approach that you're taking is that you're very much looping in the Treasury folks from day one. This isn't something that's just existing within the sort of sustainability arm of the company, which is really key to ensure that you're getting kind of an integrated corporate approach. But, curious to get your view on what Salesforce's plan as it's forming is for addressing these financed emissions.
Sure, and I'll adhere to the lightning round requirement too.
Yeah.
So
Thanks.
What we've always set out to do, the sustainability team at Salesforce, is make sure everybody at Salesforce is part of our team and do work with them. And there's an analog here, which is, I think, that sort of collaboration, true within a company from team to team, is the same that we need from organization to organization. And one of the most trusted bonds two organizations can share is to be each other's customer, right? And so I feel like for many of us leaders, we're very mature on those strategies that we can see out within our own four walls, within our own control. And the next wave is going to be when two companies team up to help meet each other's climate needs. We did that in a really bold way about a year ago. For other suppliers, for suppliers in general, we issued a sustainability exhibit, which says that effective immediately, all standard purchasing agreements with Salesforce going forward will require climate provisions, having a science-based target and emissions reductions plan, disclosing scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, and delivering all services and goods on a carbon neutral basis or face payment penalties. And I bring that up because the end of that story, because everybody says, well, what did they say? What did they do? Right. And overwhelmingly, the response was positive. We had all of this outreach, which was either, how does my company get known to be the first to sign on to this thing? Or even a little bit more quietly, like a thank you, you've validated what I've been saying internally for years, which is like, the customer's going to need this. The customer needs us on our journey. And so I expect that'll happen here as well, where we will find peers and teammates within the banks who have now got more wind at their backs to go back into that meeting and say, no, this is really coming and it's really coming now. We need to differentiate relative to our peers. We need to differentiate our products. This is the beginning of a movement that will allow us to outcompete based on climate. And so what's next for Salesforce? Continuing to try to be the leader in terms of how transparently we disclose our footprint across all of scope 1, 2, 3 and all 15 subcategories of scope 3, and also work with the team collaboratively internally to get an alignment on what levers we can explore first, fastest, most, and then bring that unified approach to really positive oriented conversations with the banks to figure out how we can help one another.
Yeah, that's great. And this lightning round continues here, but I'm going to ask a very big question. So apologies in advance, Vanessa and James, for making you answer this so quickly. But you know, as we've talked about this kind of today, there's this aspect of this that it's a struggle, right? Like we've noted that there isn't the options. You can't just switch right now from bank A to bank B and solve the problem. But I think that all of us here on the panel today have a real sense of optimism and kind of hope for the future, that we know that we're just at the beginning of this journey, but that we're going to be able to get there. And so as you think about what companies can do to move forward with this, you know, for the folks on the panel today, excuse me, on the audience today, and the people who will be watching this webinar in the future, you know, where should they start as a company, you know, as individuals within companies, and why should they feel hopeful about the ability to be able to move forward with this?
I can offer something. I mean, my discipline's a strategist, and as a strategist, you're always looking to think, well, the next thing you should choose should be the thing which makes the most difference. And I think that's a function of leverage and impact. So leverage is maybe if you're in the finance function, rather than only looking internally about what the finance means to you, is to look at what is it that you mean to your finance industry customers. So what fees are you paying? What is your business worth? What leverage do you have in that relationship compared to other places you could go, other options that you might have? And then the impact that you can make. So what might a switch from either the bond portfolio or equity funds or banking providers, partners, what could that make? And by just making that one choice, which is going to make a lot of difference, helps to be able to kind of build the case, helps to build some of that feedback loop that Patrick just described, where you can actually enter into things which are not combative, they're actually positive, generative conversations. And I think that starting that can then be the first step in the process.
Absolutely. I think James is critically right. Another thing worth mentioning is that this is also the trajectory in which regulation, even at a moment when we are seeing national climate bills collapse, is going. These standards are being standardized, if you will. If you look at some of what the US is doing with its Securities and Exchange Commission climate disclosure regulations and guidelines that are in formation at the moment, this is going to increase transparency about emissions and exposure and financial risk that will be connected to reporting and encourage and even mandate better reporting on these issues from financial institutions as well as corporations. It also means that we have the greenhouse gas protocol, which many of you are familiar with, that guides reporting on emissions, is looking at how to incorporate and measure and require cash accounting as well. So the more that these standards are put into place, this is where the field is going. And you can be ahead of this. You can figure out how to do this and be ahead of the game. You can communicate that to your financial institutions and let them know that this is where the world is heading, and it's best to be prepared so that there's competitive advantage as well as synchronicity in doing the right thing. All of that is in service of what you are asking for from the bank.
Yeah, that's great. And I just to sort of build on one quick thing you said, Vanessa, and I know we were chatting about this offline the other day, but like in a world in which, you know, Build Back Better no longer exists or is not going to go through in any form that we look like. I mean, when we're talking about banks and their capacity, I mean, I think it was the 4 largest banks in the United States over the last 6 years have invested $1.2 trillion in fossil fuels alone, which is more than twice the amount of money that is, would have gone into a Build Back Better program for clean energy investments. And so the scale here, when we talk about the transition, is really massive in terms of what we can do by pushing these financial institutions and moving that money away from the bad stuff into the clean tech solutions that we need moving forward. And so, I know, Julie, I'm going to hand it over to you here, because I know we have some questions from the audience, but really appreciate the four of you, all of the tremendous work that you've been doing over the last few years, your partnership with us and with me, and appreciate the insights you shared today.
Thanks so much, Paul. Yeah, and thanks to all the panelists. Super deep and inspiring points that you all made, and really excited to be continuing this work. Ask this question first from Mike. What are some examples of how are banks and insurers responding when they're asked to change practices? What services are the hardest to switch? So I think that could be maybe a good one for James, and then Charlie. I'd be curious to get your perspective on that as well.
Yes, so we're already seeing, subsequent to the report coming out, that there's a trend in banks being able to offer things like green corporate deposits, for example. And that's an easier sort of thing for a bank to do, because it can wrap up something as a product. It's more difficult to be able to kind of really change the bank's policies at the core, in terms of, the really difficult stuff is being able to do something which is going to be applied globally, universally, in terms of the things which are going to be really matching on the carbon budget. In terms of services and service switching, there's another meta trend in finance, which is no surprise to anyone probably on this call, which is that finance is being disaggregated. And a lot of what a bank even means, or a financial institution means, is it tends to now be a collection of different solutions, digital, fintech, things which are being aggregated and being given a sort of an overall kind of trust wrapped, or sort of an overall integrated customer proposition. And some of those individual solutions might be able to be more switchable. And I think there's another related question on that. But as we see maybe some of the aggregation of some of the solutions, if you think about money transfer, international money transfer services, most people would have done that in a bank 10 years ago. Anyone who's still doing it as a bank now probably hasn't realized that it's about 10 times more expensive. There's massive amounts of disruption happening in the financial sector that could be purposed to kind of accelerate that opportunity for positive disruption.
Yeah, Charlie, any additional thoughts to add on to that?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that we're very cautious about is greenwashing in the banking industry. James mentioned this, but a lot of banks will take sustainability as an opportunity to just market a product that is essentially no different than it was prior to adding a sustainability spin to it. So one of the things that we really look out for is what are they doing on the good side, but also what are they doing on the bad side? And a really good proxy for that is looking at the ratio of clean energy lending to fossil fuel energy lending, because I think that's a good gauge for how how much a bank is participating in the energy transition. And the data for that is challenging to find. I know Bloomberg put out a report over a year ago at this point. And unless you have access to a Bloomberg terminal, and which costs about 20 grand a year, it's going to be hard to come up with that information on your own. So that's one of the challenges that we face. And then on the second part, what services are hardest to switch? Again, going back to James's first comment about how the business of banking is borrowing short-term, lending long-term. The hardest services to switch are the lending side, at least from a corporate treasury perspective, because those are longer term agreements. Whereas short term cash, it's as simple as opening up a bank account at another bank that might be more sustainable. So that's the easy side, but the hard side is definitely renegotiating credit lines and finding a bank that wants to lend to you. And those credit lines or term debt can be anywhere from 1 year to 5 years to 10 years, so that they can be a little bit more challenging to move in and out of.
That's great. We've got one more question here from Chidi. Does the panel think that green correspondent banking networks are a potential goal that follows? can we involve Swift? And I'll admit that I don't know what Swift means. So maybe we can define that. Yeah, and so yeah, maybe, I don't know if Vanessa, Paul, James, that might be a question for you.
Go ahead.
I mean, just very briefly, I mean, it's an addendum to what I said earlier, which is that it's an ecosystem approach. I mean, Climate Safe Lending Network, the reason why we try to have this kind of broad sort of 360-degree set of stakeholders, because the solution set isn't just about one particular actor moving in a different direction, it's about the whole system. So Swift, which is kind of, some of the background for the payment systems, and other sort of platforms, the digital architecture, which is now much more the integration of multiple bits of technology being woven together to be an overall integrated proposition, opens up that possibility for it to be, for other maybe much more progressive driven banks to get hold of some of these things which enable them to deliver the services to multinational corporations who are going to need services to be able to follow their business trajectories.
And I just to add to that, I think more and more what this really shows us is that banking in the 21st century is a different kind of system. No longer do many groups rely on a single bank for all services. Services can be more and more fractured, and oftentimes you have many banks. Having worked with many individuals, BankFWD recognizes that many individuals do their investing through arms that are different and have custodial banks that hold their cash. This is something that is something we can look at more and more as sort of temporary solutions for corporations that are looking at custodial accounts and holding their cash elsewhere, or making their investments elsewhere, thereby starting to show they can separate their business in certain ways from banks. And the key message here is that net zero commitments are contingent on working with banks to meet them together, and that banks' net zero commitments drive and determine the ability of every corporation that has made a net zero commitment to be able to meet their own, and communicating that to banks and letting them know that they cannot be the reason that companies as their clients are on the hook for potentially not meeting public commitments they have made in great faith. That's a key message to communicate, because they cannot hold your intentions hostage. And the more that we communicate that as a collective front, the more that banks, in response to their clients, will be encouraged to change.
Yeah, that's great. I've got one other question that I'd love to ask Patrick and Charlie, maybe both, just to kind of wrap things up here. And that's kind of, putting myself in the position of a company that's looking at this kind of new solution. I think you could think like, maybe, this is not necessarily like our job, right? This is the job of the financial institution, the bank, to be thinking about their net zero goals. It's enough work to think about decarbonizing my scope 3 emissions without the category 15 part of it. That's a huge amount of work, and a lot of sustainability teams are kind of overwhelmed by that. So why do you think about like this sort of piece, this banking aspect of it, as like a core part of your sustainability strategies? And why is it kind of, does it feel like it is your job to be working on those things, not just these banking partners or financial institutions? And yeah, Patrick, I'll hand it over to you.
Charlie, Charlie, I'll go first because you're going to have the better answer, so that way I don't need to follow you. No, the Les Brown quote, better to aim high and miss than to aim low and hit. This is an emergency. To James's point, we need leverage and impact in mind. When I wrap all of that together, any aspiring leader in this year on planet Earth needs to be putting as much effort as possible towards those strategies that have a chance to deliver impact at a speed and scale that planet Earth can actually notice. So diverting time away from the incremental operational stuff towards those things that just might catalyze systemic change far, thousands of times bigger than even Salesforce's value chain. That's what we need. And I'll take as many of those strategies as we can give a good shot at. Because to focus on the small stuff, even if it's more known, it just isn't going to add up enough. So I feel a big responsibility to take the big swings as much as we can.
Great. Yeah, and Charlie, maybe just 30-second answer here.
I'll do my best. I'll just say that banks are slow to move, especially the largest of the large banks. You know, the top 4 in the US, they're going to bank the whole economy. And as long as there's fossil fuels in the economy, they're going to continue lending to fossil fuels. So I think it's up to clients to lean on them and hold them accountable. It's my view that clients are the most effective and loud stakeholder that banks have. They're going to listen to shareholders, they're going to listen to activists, but they're really going to listen to clients when they're saying that, you know, we're going to end the business with you unless you start to change. So that's kind of the mentality that Patagonia has taken. You know, we have a very effective voice, and we're definitely going to use it.
That's great. Thanks so much. And I know we're pretty much at the hour, so I'm just going to wrap this up. But we've covered a lot of information here today. And so if there's just 4 takeaways, these are the kind of takeaways that we'd love to, you know, have you go away with. So there's kind of the key actions. So one is to, you know, all companies should be measuring your financed emissions. This is super important. And this eventually and hopefully will become a mandatory thing for companies. 2, engage with your existing financial institutions on climate and sustainability, making clear requests. So we've talked a lot about this today. 3, act to demonstrate the demand for green finance. We've got a few different examples of how companies can do that. And then 4, publicize. So ideally, we kind of are building momentum for this solution. And then, yeah, just want to reiterate, please follow up with us. You know, these are 3 kind of specific actions you can take, and you know, get in contact with me, get in contact with Vanessa, Paul. We're here to kind of help you support you through these solutions. So if you need, you know, support with talking points to have internal dialogues with you know, sustainability folks, leadership, finance teams, we're here to help you with that. If you're interested in running the numbers, like, you know, Paul went through some of the numbers in the Carbon Bankroll report. If your company is not represented there already and you'd like to kind of like do that analysis, let us know. We can help run the numbers for you. And then lastly, you know, in the short term, you know, just any sort of pressure on these financial institutions can really help. So if you're interested in receiving kind of a ready-made template letter that you could send to your financial institution, you know, Vanessa at BankFWD has those templates ready to go. So those are some very concrete actions. Yeah, and with that, just wanted to thank you all for joining. Thanks to the speakers, and really hope to stay in touch with all you in the coming weeks and months ahead. Yeah, thanks so much.